that as we are integrating land acknowledgements and honorings into our day-to-days, they're at the beginning of our trainings, knowledge sharing spaces, our meetings, different events that we're attending, that it's always important for us to be grounded in the understanding that these are active moments of reflection and commitment. So we are honoring a certain people, we are honoring a certain land and the relationship between those two entities, but it is also remembering that through that honoring and through that acknowledgement, it comes with an accountability system, accountability measures, accountability to both those communities and those lands. And so, especially as a Canadian sector, it's always important for us to be really grounded in the calls of Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, across the land that is known colonially as Canada, and especially their calls for re-indigenization, their calls for reparations, their calls for being able to live on the lands as they see fit, and through the relationships that they've had through time immemorial. As a sector that works globally, it's also important for us to remember that we are in relation, in connection to globally Indigenous communities, and that same relationship that we are creating and being accountable to on the lands that we occupy here is the same respect and accountability and commitment that we have to have with Indigenous communities globally, especially being engaged in relationships of learning, action, and responsibility, of growth, and through ethical means. I honor the land traditionally known as Chukchake, the island that has been the site of so much movement and connection. I always say that my background is in community organizing. It's kind of where my heart work is, where I feel the best and the most grounded. And a lot of the work that I have had the opportunity to do has been in relation to Indigenous communities here, and a lot of the knowledge that I've gained, a lot of the resources that I've been able to acquire and understand and use
Que je
have
pouvais
been
utiliser. Et tout ça, c'était en relation avec la communauté autochtone et avec les relations qu'on a pu construire ensemble était vraiment au cœur de toutes mes intentions. Et je suis quelqu'un qui vit, je n'ai pas vécu trop longtemps à Teotihuacan, mais je honore ces gardiens des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous vivons. Et c'est important pour quelqu'un qui travaille dans ce secteur de la coopération internationale et dans le domaine aussi que je travaille dans le domaine de l'antiracisme. C'est très important de s'engager avec les communautés parce qu'on peut vraiment avoir des perspectives diverses. Et moi, je suis vraiment engagée pour la libération. J'ai eu les privilèges et une appréciation, comment on peut connecter nos luttes, comment on peut trouver les manières pour vraiment être à la recherche de libération collective. Donc, il y a les questions de réflexion que j'offre. Quand on pense honorer l'île territoire, il faut penser à qu'est-ce que cela veut dire honorer les territoires pour vous, pour votre organisation. Comment vous pouvez honorer la territoire et pour vous, comment vous pouvez mener des actions euh, pour vous, pour votre organisation. Quelles sont les actions que vous avez mises en place pour être en relation avec les communautés autochtones de la terre sur laquelle vous travaillez et comment vous pouvez contribuer à la souveraineté des peuples autochtones? Vous pouvez répondre à certaines de ces questions dans le chat si vous voulez. Les et donc, les terres,
custodians of those lands or who are currently fighting for those lands. So we go over community agreements and assumptions before we go into our presentations. This will probably be the last time that we do them in the presentations. In the future, we'll be sharing them in advance. But the idea between agreements and assumptions are the community agreements and assumptions are that we are coming together really quickly under one purpose, and we are creating a community in this space. And we're doing so without the time that we usually have to kind of establish community in really intentional ways that allow us to understand each other and our experiences and our identities and our needs and our expectations and how to build account. There's so many parts of building a community that doesn't happen when we have to do it in such a small amount of time and for a small amount of time. And so this is just a way for us to be able to get on the same page and to collectively commit to essentially existing together with the best of intentions and some collectively agreed upon foundation. So these are all editable. We are able to question any of these, add, change, move any of these. So the first agreement is we trust you to do what you need to do to ensure your full participation and that you will communicate your needs as they change. We commit to participating with a spirit of openness. Sorry. We trust you to do what you need to ensure your full participation and that you will communicate your needs as they change. And we commit to participating with a spirit of openness and to learning. Number two is we are committed to building a safer space, prioritizing confidentiality, equitable participation, honesty, and ownership over our words and actions. And number three is we are coming here open-minded, intending to be respectful and accountable, and we will call out harmful behavior. So I'll leave a moment to see if there's anybody who has any questions, anything they'd like to add, remove. Okay. For the community assumptions, so every day as we're moving through the world, as we're engaging with different people, we make probably millions of assumptions. And sometimes in spaces like that, making those assumptions can lead to some harmful or difficult situations to navigate. And so as we're navigating this conversation, these are some of the assumptions that we are collectively agreeing to help us see each other and engage in each other in the best way possible. Again, fully editable. So all the systems of oppression exist and are interconnected. The body does not lie. Opposing systems of oppression, building alternatives, and cultural change are all necessary. Dismantling systems of oppression benefits everyone. Everyone deserves the autonomy of choice. Liberation is possible. An individual and or a community is the expert of their own experience and the solutions to the problems they face. We live at intersections and we all benefit and are harmed by systematic oppression, even in different ways. Systemic oppression, confronting social injustice can be painful and or joyful. We are all here because we want and choose to be here. So again, I'll give a moment to make sure that this sits well with everyone before we move on. Okay. So a really quick overview of the ARC Hub. So we are a dedicated coordination secretariat and a resource center for the Canadian and international sector, which essentially boils down to we create knowledge sharing spaces, training spaces, resources, supports, um, spaces for exchange, all of the different spaces that help the sector integrate anti-racist principles and practices, do questioning, explore and delve deeper into what that means and how to create sustainable ways forward, while recognizing that this work has existed for a long time, a very long time before us. In a lot of ways, it's the inception of our sector. And the who we are, the what we do, the where, and the why are also questions that I always like to throw back at folks, especially when we're talking about integrating anti-racism into this sector. So who are you? Who are you at your core? What are the things that are foundational to you? What are the things that make you who you are? And then thinking about how that informs your engagement in this work, what you do. And so what in this sector, what is the work that you do? What is your responsibility? What is your kind of area of expertise or the way in which you engage in international cooperation, development, humanitarian work? where do you do it? So contextually, how does this work land in where you do this work, whether it be here or globally, and why? Why are you engaged in the work that you do? What motivates you? What keeps you accountable? What keeps you committed, and what informs the sustainability of this for you? So something that I think is always important for us to be grounded in understanding the work of the ARC Hub is that we are an anti-racist cooperation hub. And so I think the quote from Angela Davis always comes up for me is that in a racist society, which we live in, especially in the Western context in North America and Canada, it is not enough to be non-racist. You have to be anti-racist. And I think that always brings up the difference that needs to be understood between non-racist and anti-racist. So the space in which we exist as the anti-racist cooperation hub is the space that exists on challenging of acknowledging systemic racism and dismantling it. And so it's less about making sure that people aren't racist. And even though that obviously is always the goal, but it is more about thinking of how do we address, how do we acknowledge, how do we explore and learn about the history and the existence of systemic racism in our work, and then how do we work and create sustainable paths forward to dismantling it. So going into the framework. So this is the framework that we're operating from in this presentation, and kind of the framework of anti-racism. It's always important for us to be thinking of anti-racism as a framework, and some of these things will change for people. Different educators that do this work have different wording, different structures, different grading of the framework. But the idea is really to recognize the systemic nature of racism and to see how over history it has really been ingrained into and inherent to the ways that we think about our societies, our institutions, and in those contexts has really been entrenched in ways that we have to be aware of, to be able to understand how we exist and how we contribute to racism on a day-to-day. And it does, the idea of thinking of it as a framework is really to help us understand that the commitment to anti-racism has to be continuous. It has to be structured. It has to be thought of holistically. And it has to really be something that we come from a really genuine place of thinking about equity, out of challenging power dynamics, and the ways in which not doing those things can perpetuate racial injustice. And it really boils down a lot of the time to a transformative approach of really thinking about our goal and thinking about
Matrice qui donne la priorité à une réflexion approfondie et nos objectifs. Et je pense à toutes les parties, par exemple, qui vont être vues pour pouvoir changer les structures pour que tout puisse être vraiment durable. On peut avoir des transformations, des processus qui vont libérer.
So we always start off at awareness and education. So it's really important for us to be recognizing and acknowledge the existence of racism. Sometimes something that I always like to go back to is and again, I haven't had the chance to go back to find the person who said this, but I found it really important and something that was kind of confronting because I think for some time, a lot of the time, our first go-to is to say, I'm not racist or there isn't racism here, but essentially the idea that this educator was sharing was around the fact that it would be very beneficial to us all as folks who are invested in anti-racism, decolonization, and the end of marginalization and oppressive systems, to be understanding that there isn't a lot of ways for us to be raised and born into racist societies and societies that are founded on racism without being racist. It's not something, I think it's something that is obviously not comfortable. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to go out there and be like, yes, I'm a racist, but I think it's always important for us to be a little bit more honest and reflective about the ways in which racism is so far entrenched in the ways that we think and do and practice in our work and our personal lives, engage in our different relationships and are the systems and institutions, the healthcare system, the educational system, the legal system, the political system. So many of those things are founded on racial hierarchies, on harmful racial norms, and on the continuation of a lot of the norms that were entrenched into our societies and our in our institutions through colonization and imperialism, that it would be hard to say that we don't have a lot of racist ideals and ideas. And so step one is always to be aware of and to educate ourselves about racism, and really from a point of understanding the historical and systemic roots of it. And then it always goes to the self-reflection and unlearning of bias, which always kind of comes in with the awareness and education. A lot of the time when we are becoming aware and we are teaching ourselves or learning about racism, self-reflection kind of comes up and it forces us to challenge some of our biases. And so reflecting on those things, our prejudices, our privileges, while actively trying to unlearn them and to challenge them is always really important. And we always have to be aware, obviously, that those things are really difficult. And when we go back to kind of the idea of this needing to be something that we're unwavering about and really committed to, a lot of the time people stop at this second stage because of the discomfort and the difficulty. And it's important for us to be using that moment to continue on, because the next step is a lot of the time even more difficult, which is understanding how racism intersects with so many other systems of oppression and kind of further allows us to understand the systemic roots of racism. And so a lot of the time in these moments, we think about ability, we think about gender, we think about nationality, we think about socioeconomic statuses, we think about sexuality, we think about all of the ways that you can see systems of oppression being kind of perpetuated in our society. Race comes in often when we're thinking about the framework of anti-racism. We think about how race is coming in and kind of coming together with those terms and perpetuating creating deeper experiences of marginalization and of oppression. Intersectionality as a term was created obviously by Kimberly Crenshaw, that we always like to name and is always important to name because she created it specifically to explain the intersection of being Black and a woman. And obviously the term has kind of been co-opted and has kind of grown into a different space, but I think it's always important for us to come back to the root, that this word was really meant to explain and to highlight what it means to live at the intersection of two very foundational systems of oppression. So often you'll hear about how patriarchy perpetuates racism, and as two foundational systems of oppression, they are very interlinked and important to each other in how we look back at colonialism and imperialism and the establishment of racial hierarchies and of patriarchal systems as the norm, and kind of the pinnacle of power. After intersectionality, we see, and so after intersectionality of really looking at systems and how they intersect and create experiences of oppression, and we see race in how it exists at those intersections, we go into community engagement and advocacy. And these three are important for us to be understanding and doing and grounded in before we get into community engagement and advocacy, because this is when you're really coming into community and coming into relation and engagement with community, and you want to have done a lot of self-reflection and unlearning, and you want to have a really clear awareness of racism, and especially intersectionality, because you're engaging with people, obviously, that have very deeply intersectional identities, as we all do. And when we're grounded in those things is when you kind of create a safe a safe identity that can come into contact with community. Because I think something that as an educator, as a community worker, something that I often see is that engaging in when someone that holds a lot of privilege comes into a community that doesn't, a lot of the time, what no matter what, biases, privileges are going to be challenged. And those can create really harmful and violent situations because there is also the power dynamic that's coming in. And so those three steps come before, because it is the idea that you are equipping yourself with the tools and the understandings to safely engage with a community that inherently has less power, and that has less power, obviously, in a dynamic that one community has power because another doesn't, vice versa. And that can be really harmful and perpetuate really difficult situations to navigate. And without those tools, can, be exacerbated. So engaging and learning from community is always really important, to moving past then kind of the self-work, kind of learning from community, learning from their experiences, learning from their needs, learning from their expectations, their histories. And a lot of the time, especially if we're talking about in the work system, is like taking those things and being able to advocate for change as a person, let's say, with privilege and power. And so policy changes, institutional reform, and especially whether or not we're talking about it from the policy and institutional way or just person to person and in community, it's always the goal is to address and challenge harmful norms. And then to be in solidarity. So aligning our fights is where I start, because a lot of the time we talk about solidarity as this thing. It's just kind of, you're working with people, you're working in relationship with communities. But it's important to know that solidarity is something that you can only be in once you understand your personal goals, your personal movements, your personal priorities. You have to, the reason why I use the language of aligning our fights is that you have to know what your fight is. You have to know what your priorities are. You have to know what you're working for in your life before you align yourself with others. I think sometimes I'll use the example of like in the workplace, and especially in the international cooperation sector, as we're focused in, we'll say things like we're aligned with marginalized communities, we're aligned with local communities, racialized communities. But then what does that mean when power is challenged? And what does that mean when your personal goals for your career are challenged, and your personal priorities and what you thought your life and your life in this work would look like? A lot of the time, that does kind of challenge the idea of being in solidarity. And so solidarity is really not a word, it's a practice, it's an active reflection, it's an active commitment, it's a part of an accountability process to each other, to be aligned in what we're fighting for. And sometimes obviously things deviate, but the idea is that we have a common goal that we're moving toward with common respect, and acknowledgement, especially of the marginalized communities. Through that, what often exists as a power imbalance. So standing in solidarity with the racialized communities while leveraging our personal privileges to amplify marginalized voices and engaging in anti-racism is something, again, I think we often hear about leveraging of acknowledging our privilege. I think sometimes, as I've done this work now for 10 years, it's been interesting. Sometimes we kind of get stuck with the acknowledging of our privileges. And I always think that it's important for us to realize when we're in conversation and in community or in engagement with oppressed groups, racialized groups, it's one thing to acknowledge our privilege for ourselves. But when we are acknowledging our privileges for others, it's important for us to recognize that there isn't a lot of weight to that acknowledgement unless we're able to understand where that privilege can be leveraged and that we're actively using that privilege. So I can say, I am someone who got to go to university. That's a huge privilege. in how we kind of give people points in society, and we value certain identities and experiences, and that those things give us power. And I can acknowledge that in my community, but then what do I do with the fact that I am someone who went to university? What do I do with that power? How do I enter spaces like this? What am I sharing? What am I prioritizing? And it's one of the reasons why anti-racism and equity has been the direction of my career, because that is how kind of that is how I saw myself leveraging that power of being able to access specific spaces and being able to kind of bring the calls that community have had and the fights that we have that are often not listened to from people who are not seen in the way that, for example, someone who has gone to university has. So when you are, all this to say, when you are acknowledging your privilege, what are you doing with that more so than just saying, I have this privilege and I know I do? And it's always important to not to speak for, but to amplify marginalized voices. Continuous growth and learning. So remembering that this is lifelong. A lot of the time I hear a lot of folks say, we don't have time, we don't have capacity for this now. And it's always important to recognize that when we are saying we don't have time, we don't have the capacity, that we're essentially saying that this identity, this group, this person doesn't have value here or now, and has to wait for. And that can be really difficult for a person who is also being systemically excluded. And so remembering that this is something that we have to be committed to continuously. We have to be creating sustainable systems for, comprehensive systems for, and really be seeing this as something that has to keep going until the goal is achieved. And action and accountability. So when we are doing this work, making sure that we have goals, making sure that they're clear and concrete, and that they're being followed up with actions that really aim to challenge and dismantle racism, both professionally and personally, and making sure that we are accountable to the goals that we set. So a lot of the times when we're saying that we are anti-racist, what does it mean to be accountable to saying that? Who are we accountable to when we're saying that? And what are the systems and the structures that we are creating to ensure that that accountability, that accountability exists for the people who the work is supposed to benefit? So first, personal reflection slide. So on the slide, you'll see a few questions. I'll give 5 minutes, just because I know we're starting off. I know that people don't always like to speak up, or we're still warming up. So feel free to pick a question or two and either share an answer in the chat or out loud. I do tend to talk a lot, but I actually much rather other people be contributing and us being able to be in conversation, because we learn most from each other. And so please feel free to raise your hand and to share. And I think Megan will let me know because I can't see if somebody is sharing, raising their hand. Megan will let me know, and or you can just unmute if you have a question or you want to answer a question. So we'll give it 5 minutes. We'll go until 1:40. So let's not do 5 minutes in silence. It might be a little uncomfortable.
I have a reflection to share, if that's all right.
Definitely.
So my name is Julia, and I have been with the Canadian Food Grains Bank for the last 6+ months. And previously, I was working in sustainable food systems in the domestic agriculture space here in Canada, and I was really wanting to do this work internationally. And it was interesting when I was looking at different job postings, because a lot of them asked for field experience, but I didn't have field experience because I was kind of told, like, it's not so good anymore for white people from North America to go into those contexts. It's much better for us to lift people up and empower people to have those jobs locally. And I was all for that. But then I was running up against this challenge of like, I'd really like to work in this space, but I chose not to go work in the field because I thought it was better not to. But then it was a job expectation to be able to work here in Canada. So I really appreciated how you highlighted these dynamics can have an impact on the career choices that we make. And in order to lift others up and provide opportunities for other people, we might need to step aside from those opportunities ourselves.
I really like that thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that that is a really, really important example. And thank you for sharing, because I think sometimes we don't, I use this example a lot, but I don't often hear it in real time. But yeah, I think it's always difficult. We go into this work being really committed, and sometimes it's kind of like, what do you do when you had this career goal and you had this path kind of drawn out, and now it's changed because of the context of kind of wanting to move in an anti-racist and decolonial way. So thank you for sharing.
Hi, my name is Sukaina. I work for the Humanitarian Coalition in communications, and we're currently working on we're trying to develop a language and visual guide for ethical storytelling, and it's partly why I decided to join the webinar today. I want to educate myself and make sure none of my biases are shown in the types of photos I select or the way I tell people's story, and moving away from language that's not very dignifying or stories that justify fundraising, that disregard people's dignity and justify that by putting forward the necessity for fundraising. So this is sort of the headspace I'm in for this workshop, and I hope to learn from it and that it will help advance our goal. And thanks a lot for the resources shared in the chat. I'm definitely looking into that.
Thank you. And after the presentation, we'll be sharing some other resources which you may have already come across that might be helpful in your creation for an ethical storytelling guide. It's some of the conversations and kind of the avenues that we've looked at the ARC Hub. And so super cool, because as you will see in the presentation, even I'll use the term Global South, which is not an ethical term. It creates a hierarchical hierarchization, or a hierarchy that is harmful and perpetuates different inequities. And so, one, thank you for being here, and two, I think it's something that we always have to keep in mind and might come up in these conversations as well. One more minute. Does anyone else want to come in?
I'm happy to, if you can hear me.
Yes.
Hi. So I work for Kairos, and one of the things that's very important to us, has always been important to us, is our partnerships with grassroots women-led organizations in countries like the DRC, South Sudan, Colombia, West Bank, and Philippines. There are other countries as well, but we're really focused on them at present. And really hearing from them and their work and making sure that they're engaged and that we're listening to them. But I do communications and advocacy, and I'm realizing we need to do a much better job in terms of when we do our storytelling, because it's important to amplify the stories that we hear from them. And that means listening to women, getting the quotes, making sure that we are authorized to use them, that the person who is speaking is willing to share, for us to share them. But I just came back from Colombia a couple of months ago, and I've been writing stories, and I realized I didn't send the story for approval. They were happy with it, but I realized I missed a step there. And why did I miss that step? So it's just one of those things of, I should have done that. How can I be better? next time.
Sharing, Cheryl, I think that that in itself is goes back to that moment, the point around this is a continuous learning journey. We are going to forever be coming up with those moments of I should have, or I knew I should have, or it comes back maybe a long time before. And so I think that that's an amazing reflection to have. And hopefully we'll be able to be integrated in the future. But I think it brings up also the fact that I think it's always important for us to remember that we will have those moments of like, I didn't do what I guess I should have, or I would have with maybe more time or more reflection. And that those things will happen forever. I know that a lot of my mentors who are now who are now in their 80s and early 90s, who have been doing this work for a long time, still have moments, and in conversations with each other, still have moments of being like, right. And so it's one of the unfortunate parts where it never ends, but it's always a good moment of kind of reassuring our commitment to and our reflections in. I see someone shared in the chat. Colonialism and imperialism has shaped international development so fundamentally that you almost feel powerless to intervene. To make an important dent, we really need to change educational systems and have consciousness of this raised from an early age, in the ways in which we teach history and tell stories in different contexts. 100%. I think that we did a training a few weeks ago. It was last week, a few weeks ago. And one of the questions at the end was around if I saw progress. And I think if I saw progress in the sector, and I think one of the things that I always go back to is that racism is foundational to most to all that we know and do in this side of the world. And it is really crucial that the perspectives that we have to being anti-racist be questionings that we have early on, because they allow us to see the ways that we are being kind of quote unquote conditioned to exist and to buy in to these systems. And so 100%, I think it's so ingrained. It's such a part of especially the work that we do in international cooperation. And so being able to have those questionings early on and really being able to have the language to do those questionings early on is really important. So one of the places that we were at the beginning of the framework was on education and awareness. And it's important for us to first be aware of and be critical of where racism shows up in our work, in the work that we do in all of the different, because international cooperation, international development, obviously is such a huge sector that touches on so many different spaces, so many different types of relationships with countries and communities. And so when we are doing our awareness and our education, or even our unlearning and our personal challenging, it's important to be grounded again in the systemic nature of racism and to really interrogate where this shows up. So you'll hear a lot in anti-racism work, the concepts of colonialism and imperialism. And I think sometimes almost to a point where it desensitizes us to how pervasive those processes are and were. And I don't really know, and I don't think that I will know what language can really fully explain how deeply embedded colonialism and imperialism are. But it's always important for us to start with colonial and imperialism being two processes that to this day really deeply ingrain racial hierarchies in our global understandings of people, communities, histories and norms. And those hierarchies and inequities kind of affecting the development policies and the power dynamics that we work through together today, that we work in today. And so it's always difficult because I think we all come to international development and international cooperation work to do good work, to do transformative work. And it is also important for us to be understanding and to be critical of the fact that development policies and their relationship to legacies of colonialism and imperialism do in themselves protect and perpetuate a lot of those racial hierarchies and inequities that create those harmful norms and harmful relationships and harmful realities for racialized communities globally. And that a lot of the ways in which our development practices perpetuate the power dynamics that have come through those processes stop us from being able to truly engage in anti-racist practices in our work because the norms through which we work are perpetuating exactly the opposite. So when we are being critical, to be really looking at colonialism. And I think we had a presentation during February that kind of did an overview of the colonial legacies and the ways in which they created racial hierarchies and all of the different ways that those processes were ingrained into our work and our understandings, both in our work and outside of it. But to be critical in this space is really requires us to employ decolonial approaches to challenge inherited power structures. And I think when I say decolonial approaches, it's important for us to realize that because we work in different contexts all across the world, that both the colonial and imperial histories and the decolonial processes all have to be contextual. It's important for us to be very critical in a contextually relevant way. So I think one of the ways that colonialism and imperialism become these kind of general like umbrella terms is that we kind of see it as one process that exists or existed, although we have to realize that the colonial projects continue. But it's important for us to be really grounded that racial groups are not monoliths. There's not one way to look at all Black people. There's not a one way to look at all Brown people, that we all exist in specific contexts and we're affected by those things differently. And so the ways that we address those things have to also be contextual. Structural adjustment programs and adjustment policies are another place that we kind of see and have seen through history. Our sector and our work perpetuate racialized poverty, and this is where you'll start seeing the term Global South. We use, in our sector, we often use Global South. A term that I most of the time use is mid vulnerable countries. However, I've been having conversations with other educators, other folks who are in this community and who make up racialized communities. And mid vulnerable communities is also a term that is being contested as being maybe a term that also perpetuates harmful dynamics, I guess. And so right now in the presentation, we use Global South because I think it's a word that is still being widely used in our sector, but it isn't to say that this is an appropriate term at all. The Global South creates kind of the dynamic of the North at the top, the South at the bottom. It has no scientific relevance. It just is really a way that we put a lot of the time racialized and colonized countries at the bottom and create kind of like the paternalist relationship. So the policies and the programs that have existed that have kind of created the dependencies between these countries and Western countries in the ways that they've created dynamics and impoverished nations and created, again, those dependencies and kind of broken down systems within Global South countries is another way that we perpetuate, that we see racism perpetuated, and that we see our work touch on a space where racism is perpetuated. And so important, always important for us, I think sometimes, and I would say that we have enough of a critical lens today to understand that structural adjustment policies have been incredibly harmful. Neoliberal policies, austerity policies have all been very harmful for communities, but it's another space that is uh, is kind of promoted as being this helpful, benevolent act. And it's another space where we have to be critical because it is a way that we see racism perpetuated under the guise of being kind and helpful, and through the process of kind of breaking down countries that are breaking down, and not only just breaking down, but allowing for Western forces to take power of often racialized countries, marginalized communities, and kind of extracting in a way that creates the image of these countries being less than or needing us in these ways, without having the critical eye that we are actively disempowering marginalized and racialized communities so that we can be exploitative, and that those things have been normalized through colonialism, imperialism, that created racial hierarchies and allowed us to understand that certain communities, certain lands have to be exploited, um, um, have to be taken on in these ways. Sorry, I lost where I was. But thank you, Megan. I'm getting time warnings at the same time because I'm not great with time. But yeah, the idea is to be critical of structural adjustment policies and many of the ways that we tend to say things are benevolent, things are nice, things that we're just doing to help, and seeing a little bit deeper into the ways in which they are often perpetuating power imbalances, power and racial hierarchies. Global supply chain. So often in agriculture, manufacturing, and in extractives, we see exploitative practices really harm ethnic minorities, indigenous communities, often migrant workers, which we know are often racialized groups. And again, something that has been normalized over histories of disempowerment, of land grabbing, of policies that kind of have created these dynamics that kind of push people and displace people for work, but also because of different types of crises. And these dynamics often are worsening inequities and inequalities. And to address these things, again, take a critical analysis, take prioritizing marginalized communities' rights and well-beings, creating the policies and the practices and the new norms to being able to create an effective, an ethical partnership between the two. I see that there are comments in the chat. Important to make linkages by asking questions and linking things to stop limiting how far back we look and what we question. Acknowledging privilege requires this, however uncomfortable. Pressure from those affected is constant. How we react is critical. Change will be slow anyway. No one jumps out of their skin. Even animals who shed their skin molt, but trying to block it means no movement. The Global South is historical. For now, it serves, but will change. We talk of a Global South in the North to demonstrate the nuances. It used to be third world or developing countries. Yes, and global supply chains represent the present and the opportunity to link that to the past. This is a place where we can change perspectives, where critical analysis makes sense, 100%. So we have another personal reflection slide. So some of the questions: how has colonialism or imperialism shaped the current socioeconomic landscape in the regions where you work? In what ways do colonial legacies manifest in development policies and power dynamics? So I think a lot of the people that I've worked with, even in international development, often don't know what the histories of colonial and imperialism are in the countries in which they work, and specifically don't know how those histories have impacted current socioeconomic landscapes. And I often hear that racism isn't something, or the conversations around racism aren't something that exists in racialized countries. And I think it's always interesting because of colonial and imperialism, we use the terminology of racism because we are in a country of power. But it's important to realize that those processes have created those conversations and those reflections in other countries, but from a different perspectives. And that the establishment of global racial hierarchies has had effects across the world. And so the conversations of racism or of anti-racism are global. It's just important for us to be aware of those histories and how they shape the context in the countries that we work, to be able to be tuned in our relation to those things in these conversations, into those histories and in those contexts and those realities in the countries that we work in, because otherwise, of course, it's hard to see. What ethical considerations arise when working in contexts where colonial legacies persist? Have you witnessed firsthand the disproportionate impact of structural adjustment programs on marginalized communities in the countries where you work, and how has that impacted your approach? And what ethical dilemmas do you encounter when navigating the complexities of the global chains in your development work? So these are some of the, obviously you can pick any of the questions, or if you have your own personal reflections, please feel free. We'll take another 5 minutes and feel free to unmute your mic to share.
Hi, I think I'd like to give an example I'm sorry, I'm not turning on my video. I'd like to give an example that I was exposed to recently. Migration can be a very powerful example because, especially from South America. And recently I went to a talk by someone from the Honduras, where they were talking about how drug cartels and the influence of gangs linked often to drugs is causing people to flee their countries, meaning that they can't stay because either you join a gang involved in drugs or you leave. Otherwise, they threaten your very life. So sometimes when we look on television at all these large crowds of people moving from South American countries across the Mexican border, approaching Mexico to get into the US, and people are like, what is happening? I think the analysis, this is one example of where making the linkages makes a difference. First of all, questions should be asked about what's happening in those countries that's affecting their economies. We talked about structural adjustment that is affecting the very capacity of people to remain and do what they've done all these decades, make a living, earn a living, live peacefully in their own countries. What is the global dynamic coming from transnational corporations, coming from governments in terms of their policies and the ways in which they interact with governments in those countries that is actually creating this impetus by people to leave because they really cannot continue to exist in those places. I think these are concrete examples. And I do think that the knowledge to make these linkages is actually much greater right here in the North. It's just not being exposed. It's just not being used, I should say, not exposed. Sometimes you see, I don't know, a CBC documentary, they have the capacity to investigate and ask these questions and expose them. Why isn't it being done more? So for me, these are questions about the real linkages, what can be done concretely, because it's not a historical thing. It's not just a historical thing. The impact of that history is very real today, and we're just not making the linkages.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much for sharing. Yeah, I think that's a very important part, to not think of these things in the past. I think structural adjustment programs are things that are still coming up today. And exactly like the example that you used is, if we are asking if we are forcing countries to a lot of the time break down their societies to be able to access specific funds or specific resources. What does that mean for the sustainability of that first the government, first that the country, the communities being able to exist in the spaces in those countries, instead of just seeing it as, oh, this poor country isn't able to sustain or to support their communities, is something that comes up often in these conversations. But I think the examples that you gave were very clear and very important. So thank you. Did anybody else want to share any reflections, questions, answers to the questions?
I can share, but I want to defer if anybody, because I've already been. I just wanted to see if anybody else wants to go.
I think you're good to go.
All right, okay. I think what strikes me, a number of things actually. What impacts our partners, some of our partners, is Canadian mining in their communities. Real colonial approaches and just how they spin it, that, you know, they're helping these communities when clearly they are not. These communities are not being consulted. Working, like I've been at Kairos for 10 years, and we still do not have really robust corporate accountability mechanisms. Our government is starting to look at it when clearly it has failed so many communities, and there's been so many issues where the ombudsperson, who is tasked to review any harms, is doing nothing about it, or very little about it. So it's just it's trying to break through the government, when you're working in the international realm and the sphere, and you look at international development, but you're also looking at trade with countries as well. I mean, there are a great deal of tensions, and you're colonial structures that the government will not acknowledge. So trying to educate the government has been really challenging, when quite often they really don't want to listen.
I think it's one of the places that becomes really difficult when we're talking about the longevity or the sustainability of this work, is that often the government isn't really going to be most invested in creating the change that anti-racist or decolonial or community-led processes are calling for. And so it's that difficulty of what exists in this space where the people responsible for quote unquote making the change aren't maybe as invested or sometimes as educated or honest about what needs to be done. That is a really difficult place, I think, in this work, and tends to be the unmoving barrier that I think decades of people have tried to kind of climb over or to break down. Thank you for sharing, Cheryl. Anybody else wanted to share? Okay. So intersectional approaches. So we talked about intersectionality, of seeing how systems of oppression kind of come together and intersect to create experiences of marginalization, and how in our work it can be seen often. Is we talk a lot, I think in past years, we've talked a lot about the intersection of gender and race, and a lot of the projects that we're seeing come into priority address race and gender. I think in the Canadian sector, it's something that we've seen as one of the priorities. And so I think it's always important for us to be thinking about how race and gender and the intersection of those two have Both, I think sometimes we think about it as, oh, being, for example, a woman and racialized in this context creates these experiences, and it's important for us to be looking at the access to culture, the experience of the experience of culture and the access to culture when it comes to being in different contexts around the world, and where race and gender intersect, and how from the Western perspective we kind of look through our lens at those realities. The access to resources is also affected by gender. And I'm obviously in gender, I'm talking past the binaries of woman and man. And I'm talking about gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, trans identities, and how that really affects our existence in different contexts globally, to culture, to resources, to power, to decision making. And I think that this is also one of the places where, when we're talking about patriarchal systems, and I mean, living in a colonial world or a colonized world, I think it's important for us to think about how patriarchal structures, and as in the West, we work from a patriarchal understanding, to think about how a lot of our policies, a lot of our perspectives, a lot of our programmatic decisions, a lot of our government priorities, coming from that structure, and our understanding of power through that structure, often do perpetuate racial inequities and prioritize the perpetuation of racial inequalities, because of needing to protect and to continue the systems of power in which we exist. So when we think about colonialism, having established the norm of the white man and the power through that perspective, Indigenous communities, or the ways in which we see the intersection of race and environmental movements, and the calls for relationships to land, and to the better treatment of land, and the end of extractive practices and models. So I think a lot of the time when we're thinking about our land, our relationship to land through the practices of our work, we talk about Indigenous communities, and it's always important for us to think about talking about Indigenous communities as a commitment and an active accountability to making sure that the voices, the identities, the histories, the traditions, the cultures of those communities are being put at the forefront and integrated into the core of the projects, and the ways in which we're shaping the way that we work with local communities. And so advocating for their sovereignty is something that we see then through the critical analysis of that intersection, as a way to kind of challenge traditional extractive models, and really wanting to create equitable and sustainable development, which I think sometimes is a term that we use, but in practice it's really difficult, because I don't want to say it's really difficult in practice, but I think sometimes the way that we practice development makes it difficult to see equitable, sustainable development as a possibility, because of a lot of the ways that our partnerships are structured, or the policies and the funding are structured around our projects. And then migration and displacement. I think there was a really, really great example given in the last slide. And I think that when we think about migration and displacement, I think we have a collective understanding that racialized communities are disproportionately affected by the way that migration and displacement is forced about throughout the world. I think the refugees crises that we see, the climate-induced displacement, so displacement due to environmental racism, we see that those types of migration often really negatively affect racialized communities, and then the ways that a lot of countries react often perpetuate racial inequities, and often don't recognize that, for example, environmental racism is something that the West has a relationship in, has a responsibility in, it has to be accountable to, but the policies that surround people who are forced to be displaced, or who have to migrate through that context of those policies and those practices and the norms don't come from a place of having acknowledged the responsibility. And so I think it's another place where we have to recognize that the intersection of race and ethnicity, of nationality, really will have an effect on the experiences of migrants, both in what creates the reason for having to migrate, but also then the policies and the practices that folks will have to go through in order to rehome. And that I think, like, we talk a lot about migration in conversations around Indigenous sovereignty and the fights of Indigenous people. And sometimes I think it is important for us to think about, we often just think of it from a side where, oh, people want to come to the West, which in itself is the perpetuation of racial hierarchies, but it's always important to think about why people have to leave, what they're leaving behind, the ways in which cultures and traditions and communities and histories are being destabilized through these practices, and how in itself, that process is part of the perpetuation of racial hierarchies and the inequities that create disempowerment and destabilization of racialized communities globally. So these are just a few of the ways. Obviously, intersectionality is something that is a huge web. We have so many different identities that we connect to, and they intersect in so many different ways, but these are just a few of the ways that we can see in the ways that our work touches different communities, that intersections can have effects, and effects that we should be addressing through our work. Another reflection slide. So, and that we'll give it another 5 minutes for folks to share. So some questions coming up to think about a specific policy or programmatic intervention that perpetuated gender and or racial inequalities within your field of work. How can you apply principles of intersectionality to redesign and implement more equitable and inclusive approaches? Reflecting on a project or initiative where you address the racialized dimensions of migration and displacement. How did you ensure that culturally competent interventions were involved in promoting social inclusion and justice? How do your own cultural backgrounds and worldviews influence your interactions with Indigenous communities? How do you work to cultivate cultural humility and openness to Indigenous knowledge systems? And this is one that can be adapted to, obviously, we think about different gendered communities, genders, and we can bring in, obviously, the experience of displacement and migration as well. So we'll give another 5 minutes to see if folks wanted to share anything, have any questions, comments, answers. And remember that there are no wrong questions or answers that we can't work through.
Hi. I can, it's me again. One thing that just came up several years ago, we were invited to come for the Jar Sands Healing Walk. And oh my goodness, who was the organizer? It was over 10 years ago, so I can't remember, but it was an Indigenous community that invited us to come. And we were there with I was there with two videographers. We're going to take a whole bunch of footage. And one thing that we were reminded or asked of when we were there, which took me back only because, oh my goodness, I didn't even think about it. The concern was we were there to bear witness and take footage, and then with the intention of putting it towards a documentary film. But we were challenged, is that an extractive practice? So we were asked if all the footage that we collected would be available to this indigenous nation. And we put that into practice. Like whenever we take video, what have you, particularly if it's with regards to an indigenous nation, or it fits with regards to even our partner, we would make sure that there is proprietorial ownership for them.
I think that that's a great practice. I feel like a lot of the time, the ones that I think are in line with the example that you gave are making sure that the Indigenous community or the community that's being captured or whose knowledge is being engaged or in a lot of ways often extracted gets to shape the process, gets to shape what of their knowledge is shared, how it's shared, when it's shared, which parts are shared, and then making sure that there's the compensation around it. But I think that the practice, the way that you shared it, of making sure that you're asking and kind of meeting the expectations of those communities are often what I hear from different communities, what people are hoping for. So thank you for sharing. Did anybody else want to share? Okay. So, decolonizing development. So I think it's always interesting. I think every time I use the word decolonizing development, it feels a little bit, I feel like I chuckle a little bit, but the idea of decolonizing our practices or thinking of decolonial approaches to ways in which we're working with different communities, I think is something that's really important for us to be doing. Again, going back to what I was saying when we were talking about the framework, is it's always really important for us to talk about decolonization from a really contextual space. For example, from on my mom's side, I come from the Zarma, from Niger, what is known as Niger now, the boundaries that are known, the land boundaries that are known as Niger, and decolonization through that community and through their history and their traditions and what they went through in terms of even spirituality and religion is going to look very different than, for example, on my dad's side, who comes from the Bamnike Bazu in what is known as Cameroon, and their traditions and decolonization and what they would see of as decolonization. Some countries have used the process of becoming independent from their colonizers and creating creating a name for the boundaries in which they exist, decolonization. And some countries feel that being able to dismantle that process is decolonization. So it's always really important for us to think about decolonization really contextually and to understand what we're decolonizing. So understanding what the colonial history is here. So cultural competence is one of the foundational principles in decolonizing our relational practices, whether it's in development or in other places of working with communities through decolonial principles and practices. So really wanting to understand the cultures that we're working with, first understanding our culture, so understanding what we're coming in with. So for me, it would be understanding the cultures that I grew up with from both of my parents, how those perspectives were impacted by the dominant culture I grew up in, which is the Western Canadian culture, and then what that creates as a culture of engagement with other communities and other cultures. And so cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, cultural responsiveness are all different ways that we talk about being sure that we are understanding our culture, understanding the cultures that we're working with, and especially when we're coming from a place of power, wanting to understand the cultures that we're working with in a way where we are really prioritizing their cultures, prioritizing their cultural norms, their cultural identities, the traditions, the histories, especially in a way where we're not wanting to impose Western-centric models. So again, often when I'm hearing conversations around how racism isn't maybe the conversations around racism are maybe not happening in other countries. Well, the conversations that are happening is the ones around the imposition of Western norms and ideas and models in other countries, which is a part of the conversation of racism. So cultural competence and cultural sensitivity and responsiveness are all about positioning ourselves in a way where we're prioritizing the culture that we're working with or in contact with or engaging with over our own, which is in that relationship, maybe the dominant culture, quote unquote, and making sure that we are having collaborative and contextually relevant approaches. So I think a lot of the time when we're talking about these types of relationship, we are talking about community-led development. So really wanting to empower local knowledge and self-determination and really wanting to challenge paternalistic models. So the idea that we are coming in to help and we know what's best and we have the answers and we have the resources and we get to choose how much of all of that another community gets to have and how they get to use it, is kind of the idea of community-led development, of challenging that way of being and really wanting to put the community first. So the community getting to choose what the project looks like, getting to choose what the relationship looks like, of really kind of being empowered to kind of guide the change that is going to be the most relevant to the needs and the experiences of the people that often these projects are coming in to support. And community-led development also has to always think of the power imbalances for marginalized and racialized communities. And so I think sometimes in do-good situations, we want to stay away, or we want to kind of come from a place of not doubling down on the power dynamics, but it's always important for us to know what the power dynamics are to make sure that we're not perpetuating them or amplifying them. And again, community-led development, I think sometimes community-led development, localization, the power shift and how kind of the language around shifting power has happened, I think is something sometimes, a lot of the time we get stuck in the space where the funder or the country that is implementing the space where we get to have a program somewhere else often has the power, in the end, has the power to choose how much of the community, how community-led the development project is. And so that's still an existence of that power imbalance, right? And it's always important for us to be aware of the power imbalances so that we communicate the honest truth of what the dynamics are so that communities can kind of engage their agency as much as possible, just because at the end of the day, if we are aware that there are power imbalances, often because of the racial hierarchies, because of the histories between countries or the personal goals, the goals that certain governments or certain countries have, it's always just important for us to be clear about those things, because at the end of the day, they do have really big effects on our ability to be engaged in communities. And that also comes to fruition in conversations about ethical partnerships. So I think there's not a lot of difference between these three bubbles. They're all parts of thinking of how to better work with communities. Ethical partnerships really aim to challenge racial hierarchies
vise à vraiment mettre en question les hiérarchies raciales et, sur- et quand on travaille avec les communautés locales et et pour ces partenariats, il faut vraiment promouvoir le développement équitable et durable et en priorisant la solidarité, le respect mutuel et la prise de décision partagée, et aussi on aide que ça peut aider à faire face aux dynamiques de dépendance, de symbolisme et relativisme et il ne faut pas perpétuer qu'il y a un pays, un groupe, une organisation qui ont la plupart la voix de ce qui se passe dans un autre pays, notre communauté. Souvent, on ne comprend pas d'une manière très approfondie, on n'est pas bien investi et nous, on ne va pas vivre les conséquences de nos programmes. Et voilà, et une autre possibilité d'avoir 5 minutes pour les réflexions personnelles, si vous voulez partager. Et donc, vous pouvez choisir. Je vais lire quelques questions. Nous avons un commentaire. Alors, est-ce qu'on peut vraiment décoloniser ou localiser de l'eau? Est-ce que maintenant il faut
happening here and in the global south, and then there have to be spaces for them to enter into conversations with each other. Maybe shifting power is the term, as it implies doing it slowly, but it is not just about the pace, it's about the direction, 100%. And I think something that's important to bring up about conversations around localization is I think in a lot of conversations that I had about localization, it tends to be that local communities don't actually believe that localization is working, is effective, and is honest. And I think that that was the idea around the change of language and now kind of adopting the power shift agenda. But something that has also existed then in that discourse is, are we creating more language and less action? Because for example, the conversations around this sector kind of working towards the end of this sector is I think sometimes something that we avoid because localization, the idea was to eventually right shift power, and there wasn't clear definitions around localization, there weren't clear processes. What are we working towards directly? Are we being honest with communities that we're working with about what we're working towards? And are we really ready as again the dominant the country or the community with power to localize? Do we have a right to localize? Are often I think that it's often questioning that happens and that isn't clear. So it's interesting because even in the power shift conversations, a lot of those things are still happening. Who gets to lead the power shift agenda and how much power is who gets to lead given depending on their positionality in those relationships in the global context and more specifically in international development and cooperation relationships. So we'll start the 5 minutes now for whoever wants to share any questions, answers, reflections. If no one wants to share, we'll move on. So advancing racial justice, again, something that is continuous, that is ongoing, that takes a lot of action and accountability, and that it has to be as a goal, something that's ingrained into a lot of our processes, into a lot of our foundation. Some of the ways that we can see it in creating kind of that sustainable process is policy advocacy as one. I think a lot of the time when we're talking about advancing racial justice, whether it's in our work or not, creating policies that really allow for this to be ingrained into the norms, because policies create societal norms, creates institutional norms. A lot of the time are kind of what have historically led to the continuation and perpetuation of racial hierarchies. Kind of being able to counter that and to dismantle that leads to changing those policies and challenging the policies that exist. And so in the ways that we're doing policy advocacy, I think a lot of the time, one of the ones that we think of is affirmative action. So I think when we talk about racial hierarchies, we think about the fact that, for example, in Canada, we are a white-led sector. And what does it mean to be advancing racial justice in organizations that often don't have representative whose power whose power isn't necessarily in the hands of the communities most affected by the work. And I remember talking to someone after a training a while back, I think soon closer to when the ARC Hub opened. And this was a staff member at an organization that had recently immigrated to Canada and was working in an organization and was working on a project that was in the country that he was from, but in his organization didn't have any and was not at all empowered to bring in his lived experience or his perspectives into that practice. So affirmative action, I mean, wanting to see more representation, wanting to see people in positions in ways that challenge the power and challenge the norms in the ways that racial hierarchies have been embedded into even our sector is one of like the very foundational spaces. And I think we talk a lot about affirmative action policies, knowing that a lot of the time most organizations don't meet the marks, but really in the idea of wanting to bring in more people who are affected into the decision-making spaces that affect them. Reparative justice initiatives to rectify historical injustices are things that communities have been calling for a really long time. The changing of policies that have been put in place historically through the colonial project to continue to disempower either countries or communities globally is something that is really, really important to being able to advance racial justice. So when we talk about, for example, structural adjustment programs and policies, I think those are things that people have been fighting for. There's endless literature about them and endless challenging and lots of data and lots of information about the harm that they've caused. And so creating policies and making sure that all of that knowledge, all of that truth that has been shared over years is enacted into ways that really challenge the structural and the systemic embedding of their effects is really important. So yeah, by challenging discrimination and promoting systemic change, we improve development outcomes. And I think that that's always important for us to remember, is that advancing racial justice in international cooperation and development inherently improves the outcomes of our work. It's always really interesting to me when the ARC Hub opened, a lot of people didn't really understand what racial justice had to do with international cooperation. And so a lot of the work that you'll see us do is very foundational, really talking first level of what anti-racism looks like and is in our sector, just to create that understanding that at the end of the day, international cooperation, the way that you would think of it is inherently to address historical injustices, and those historical injustices that have created the dynamics that we are working in are based off of the policies and the practices that wanted to uphold racial hierarchies that created really harmful practices. So a lot of the countries that we see around the world, especially racialized countries, who are going through huge extractive projects and whose lands are being taken from them, and resources and people, and all of the ways that our sector is meant to address that are inherently supposed to be anti-racist. And so obviously creating that in creating those policies, creating those ways of practice creates better development outcomes. Research and knowledge production. I mean, the knowledge production that, or the data and the knowledge that is shared through research projects creates the norms. And it's interesting because there are a lot of communities creating more ethical, or I'll say, yeah, more ethical research, and that are creating knowledge and who are sharing information about the experiences of marginalized people in very supported ways. But the ways in which we create, the ways in which a lot of the hierarchies and the ways of thinking have been normalized kind of push that to the side. So I think it's always important for us to be prioritizing marginalized perspectives um, in research, because it does transform the way that we think, the way that we talk, the norms that exist in the work that we do. Using participatory methodologies amplifies community voices and challenges dominant narratives. And so over the years, the ways in which a lot of biased, a lot of racist, a lot of colonial research projects have created these, again, really biased uh, norms in the way that we see different communities, see different countries, or understand the relationship between countries and communities and the histories of those relationships, have to be challenged through being able to kind of create uh, those challenging through true or honest research practices that are coming from the communities that have experienced those realities and those contexts firsthand. Engaging marginalized communities ensures policies and interventions reflect their lived experiences and realities. So really always in advancing racial justice, I think the avenues that we choose, the things that we do always have to be grounded in wanting to really prioritize the lived realities, the expectations, the needs, the histories, the traditions, the cultures of marginalized and racialized communities. And then again, solidarity across movements. I think we have seen, especially in recent years, but throughout all of history, the way that global solidarity movements, especially between racialized communities, has created incredible change. But I think between the West, for example, and a lot of the countries that it works with, creating that solidarity is important because it then creates accountability mechanisms that kind of shape the work that we do. But in the global solidarity movements that have existed, that have really been grounded under an understanding of collective struggle, or the ways in which struggles are interconnected, has been really important. But then we think about racial, economic, environmental justice movements in those global solidarity movements, and how they exist at the intersection of so many, when we're talking about race, indigenous communities, and the land, and environmental justice movements, when we think about how migration is affected by the ways in which a lot of countries are disempowered economically, and how it forces people to seek other countries to survive. It's important for us to think also, and to be supportive also of the ways in which diasporas are in solidarity movements, often with their own communities, and to be making sure that we are making the calls that these communities are asking us to amplify. So again, understanding what we are fighting for, to be in solidarity with other communities, and making sure that our fights are aligned in true and honest and sustainable ways. This, I promise, is the last reflection slide. So we'll give another 5 minutes and see if there's anybody who would like to share. I see in the chat. I think the point you are making is critical. I was surprised that there seemed to be no linkage between IDW and Black History Month, and yet somehow they happen in the same month. If they are in silos, it is a huge missed opportunity to make the linkage, and in fact takes away from one or the other, diluting both. Is this a conscious thing or inadvertent? whichever it is, I think the cooperation sector needs to consciously address that now and seize the opportunity, especially in relation to African diaspora communities and intersectional development in relation to Africa. Yeah, we've had that conversation at the archive many times, many times. It is very, 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 very confusing to me that there isn't that link. But then again, when I came back to the sector, through the archive, I realized that first year that most organizations weren't really saying anything about Black History Month. And I think that that is because a lot of communities don't actually understand, and a lot of sectors don't really understand Black History Month, and don't understand the history, don't understand the goal, don't understand the practice of Black History Month. And I think a lot of the focus in IDW is to ask the government for more money. And sometimes in those conversations, I ask, more money for what? Because if we are saying that this time is really to kind of collectively come to convince the government to give us the funds necessarily to do good work, then how are we communicating that good work? How are we setting those goals? How are we, in especially this month, really reflecting about what it means to be having this opportunity to ask for policy changes and to be lobbying in this way, without these reflections? I think as a sector, we do still have a lot of work to understanding the impact of race in the work that we do, even though it is such a racialized field. All of the work that we do is impacted by conversations of race. But I think that your point really hits me in the heart, and I think it's a confusion I've had, and I don't know that we're moving really closer right now to being able to integrate the two. It's why during Black History Month, we had a conversation around the relationship between anti-Blackness and anti-racism, and the history of anti-Blackness and how it connects to our work. But definitely a very important point, especially with how much Canada exists in Africa, and the opportunity for lobbying in a way that creates better development outcomes. Thank you for that comment. We have 2 more minutes. Does anyone want to share? Please, not all at once. Oh, yes.
Hi. I just, one of the things that we're grappling with, so I work for Kairos, and we are ecumenical. So our members include churches from Catholic religious orders to Quakers, and of course, grappling with the patriarchy and colonialism embedded within the churches. So this is a deep conversation that's certainly going on within the churches, especially when they're dealing with Indigenous rights, and certainly within Kairos itself. It's an ongoing conversation. We have a lot of work ahead of us still to go. And grappling within our own organizational practice too, right? How are we, what does colonization mean? What does it mean in practice? What does patriarchy mean? What does it mean in practice? What are the hallmarks? How can we, this is what I'm thinking about, how do we decouple from that, right? What does this space look like where, it's not hierarchical, where, it is deeply consultative, deeply respectful, where we work in partnership?
Those are big questions that you're asking yourself. I think they're really important questions, and they're ones that, I mean, with the questions around colonialism, they're I mean, there are a million of them, right? Because they exist contextually, and I think that colonialism is definitely an interesting one when we're thinking about the patriarchy because of what their relationship is. But yeah, I think that definitely big questions, definitely important ones. And I mean, when you have the answers, definitely do share them.
I think the point is recognizing it and doing that work, right?
And being committed to the continuation of that work. I think that that's always when it comes back is there's always a point in the questioning about colonialism and patriarchy that becomes really difficult because of how linked they are to our personal experiences of society, of power. And I think I was asked in the last presentation last week, one of the questions was just about if we tend to have a lot of men in our presentations or who attend our sessions. And I said, I don't tend to expect there to be a lot of men in this work. And often you don't see a lot of male identified or masked folks in this work because the conversations around anti-racism challenge power, and the racial hierarchy is meant to exist to support uh, the existence of the power system that patriarchy depends on. And so when you don't expect a lot of people who directly benefit from the systems that currently exist to be in the conversations to dismantle them, right? But that understanding has to exist when we're in these processes, because at every single one of us at one point will come to a moment of disempowerment when we are in these processes, because we exist, especially in the West, we exist in the perpetuation of a lot of different inequities, a lot of different systems that depend on the oppression of a lot of communities. And so I think what you're saying is important because it is that thing that we have to keep in our mind. It's continuous. And so when we get to that barrier, that one that kind of challenges and rocks our entire foundation, the one that we've grown and built our life and our worldview off of, what do we do next? Because a lot of the time what we do next is we retreat and we kind of fall back into the power that we have, because it's a scary place to be disempowered, especially if you are in a space of living a marginalized identity. But creating the goals of anti-racism is meant to engage that moment so that we know how to create sustainable structures to be able to move past that moment. So definitely thank you for sharing. I see in the chat, or what does decolonization mean in practice? It is happening, especially in church settings. The question is, can you see it and recognize it? It's definitely a good question.
And to sort of deepen that comment, I think church settings for me is one important place where you see it, because people, especially if you're talking about the global South, and for example, in the African context, they've made it their own. It has intertwined so much with local culture that if you look at it from the perspective of the people on the ground, they don't see it as a foreign thing anymore. The question is, are the people interacting with them from the global north recognizing that and acknowledging what has happened to change that relationship? Because it's only in acknowledging that you don't resist and block the change, and the change can be positive. So I guess that's why I posed the question, what does decolonization mean? And it's so important to look at decolonization from the point of view of the colonized, in quotes. You cannot talk about decolonization away from the point of view, from that point of view. I don't know if I made sense, but it's so strange. I found that so many, for the first time, I was out of the sector, well, sort of out of the sector for about maybe 5, 10 years. And when I came back and heard all these conversations about localization, shifting power, decolonization, it was like, where is this coming from? I couldn't understand it. So I called some of my colleagues who work in so-called development sector NGOs, and are you talking about this on that side? And it's like, no, we're not. Have you heard of it? Well, yes, from time to time. This is what it seems to mean. And it's sort of amazing. How can you talk about localization and the people in the place where you're trying to localize don't even recognize it as a conversation that's happening? There's something going on.
100%. I think you made a lot of sense. I think you had a lot of important points. And I think that when I've had those conversations around localization with communities, it tends to feel like, and I don't know if this came out of the conversations that you had or maybe the reflections that you had, but it tends to sometimes feel like the West takes up language to create an image at a time um, at a time where it benefits it to buy in to a conversation that makes it seem like it's prioritizing the needs of the community it works with, but never really for the communities that it works with. And so I think the point that you're making around the communities that we're working with have no idea what we're talking about or who aren't in these conversations, but the West is so deeply entrenched in the conversation right now around localization, and I guess slowly shifting to the power shift agenda, or the power shift agenda kind of happening parallel to it. But sometimes I don't know, it feels like maybe it's something that's being adopted to further the image, the do-good image, in a way where it's like this fits into this moment, the same way that the ARC Hub was created out of the conversations in 2020, even though anti-racism work in decolonization doesn't really have much to do with um it, not that it doesn't have much to do with, but the focus could have been the integration of anti-racism in this work could have been something that existed. The ARC Hub could have been born of many other situations that didn't have to do with the death of George Floyd.
Mm. Mm.
I don't know if folks had any questions or wanted to share anything else, but we have a few minutes left. Really quickly, I just want to go over the ARC Hub right now is funding 5 sectorial projects. So is funding 5 projects within organizations across the sector who are working to advance decolonial anti-racist projects. All of the information is on our website. They're kind of whatever the organization wants to do, obviously within measure, but the idea is to kind of help the sustainability of the ways in which people are engaging in these conversations through their organizations, seeing as this is technically the last year of the ARC Hub, the 3-year funded program. The ARC Hub is also hosting 2 roundtables in April, one for leaders, so CEOs, EDs, that kind of group of folks, April 11th. So it'll be a closed group for those folks in April 11th, and then it'll be a closed group for staff April 16th. And the idea is to have a conversation about the realities of doing this work, the expectations, the goals, and creating 2 reports, or we're thinking maybe 1 report on the truth, the experiences, and the expectations of BIPOC folks in this who are doing this work in the Canadian sector, and maybe hopefully creating a little bit of a roadmap for some of the expectations and the work that we can be doing moving forward. And every last Tuesday of the month, the ARC Hub hosts office hours. You can find the link on our website, our social medias. to join, and it's usually 12:30 to 1:30 every last Tuesday. We have a newsletter that goes out once every quarter. We have bulletins that go out between that pretty often to share what's going on. Please share your events with us so we can put them up on our events page. We have a roster of experts that's going to be published early April. So other folks who are doing this work or who can support organizations doing and talking about this work in the sector. We have a resource library. So, I mean, the only other way for me to explain that is a library of resources on our website of ways of different types of knowledge tools, of training tools, of education tools to kind of support your organizations, support your work in this, in kind of advancing anti-racist perspectives and practices in our work. And we have our annual report that came out last year. This year, the signatory period will be starting in the next few months. So the data collection will be starting in the next few months. But if you want to read the last report or the ones before, you can find them all on our website. And we will be sharing with you a post-event survey. We are funded by the government, and so they like to know that people are showing up to our events, and we like to know what people liked and didn't like. If you had a terrible experience, I think a lot of the time people don't answer post-event surveys if they don't have positive feedback. But as someone who has been doing this for a little while, I love negative feedback. I think it's the most helpful of the bunch. And so if you have things to share, I mean, we call it negative feedback, but really it just helps us learn and grow. And so please feel free to share it. I will obviously stay on for the next 3 minutes. So please do ask any of the questions that you have or share any comments here. And just to clarify, the ARC Hub is the Anti-Racist Cooperation Hub. And so kind of the idea of just building anti-racist cooperation practices. And is there any opportunity to seek additional funding to continue the work of the ARC Hub beyond this year? The resources and opportunities offered have been so valuable and helpful for small and medium-sized organizations. That is a great question. Honestly, I am not 100% sure about the longevity of the ARC Hub, but I think right now the idea is that the hub lives for this long. But I do think that it is something that organizations, the Cooperation Canada brought together people from a little bit of all over the sector to participate in the creation of the ARC Hub. And it was housed there because Cooperation Canada did that work. But I always like to remind folks that obviously this work exists in all of your organization. There are racialized people in organizations all across the sector who are doing this work. There are people all across the world who are doing this work. And there are people who have been doing this work for decades. And so I think sometimes also seeing where else there could be ARC hubs, I think there's always that option. The government, I think this was the first time that the government funded a project like this. And so hopefully there is a way forward. I guess it'll depend on the feedback forms or how the project wraps up. But right now, I can't say that there is really much of a path forward for the current iteration of the ARC Hub. But I will say the resource hub, the resource library will continue to exist. So that resource will continue past the 3 years.